Joe, did you want each person to take about 5 minutes to introduce themselves in the chat?
Absolutely not. All right, let's make sure it's streaming. All right, awesome. I'm still admitting to people. I'm just going to go ahead and get started. I don't want to keep everybody here too long. And wow, this is a awesome turnout. Thank you to everyone who showed up. And I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody. If anybody has a question, just bear with me because I'm moderating alone tonight. So between Facebook Live and here, if you have a question or you want to interrupt, just feel free to give a shout or something in the chat box. And for those of you on Facebook Live, I will check the feed there as often as humanly possible. And once I bring it up, something in the chat box. Muted. Awesome. And I'm going to do the record thing. I know some folks. So if you invited someone and they weren't able to come, I will record it and shoot it out to you. All right, let's do that mute all thing so I don't have to hear everybody's door chimes. And make sure it's still on Facebook Live. Awesome sauce. So yeah, as I was saying, thank you to everyone who came tonight. Aaron, if you can't hear audio, can you guys still hear me? Just give a thumbs up. Okay. Aaron, check your audio. We can do troubleshooting later. Let's go ahead and get started. So for those who don't know me, my name is Joe Martinez. I am a Mason in Virginia and DC, and in Massachusetts and in Maryland, and also in the UGLE. So I'm a joiner. But I want to thank everyone for coming tonight to this presentation. So this presentation, and I don't see him here because I was going to give him a big shout out. This presentation was supposed to be a kind of like a two-parter at my lodge. We had Brother Robert Marshall. So for those of you who know him, he is a big deal at the Grand Lodge of Texas, and he absolutely gives a phenomenal presentation on the Trivium, which will knock your socks off. So if you've not seen it, reach out to him on Facebook, and he can certainly give you that. He did that for us over Skype, and it was an absolutely amazing presentation. And if we were not dark because of coronavirus, we were going to follow up that month with the talk on the Quadrivium and touch all the 7 liberal arts and sciences, because my lodge's theme this year was the 7 liberal arts and sciences. So we were going to talk about that. So this was supposed to be, like I said, a two-parter at my lodge, but again, since we're all quarantined, figured it'd be best to share it with all of you. And so with that, I will go ahead and get started. There's way too many people here that I know and love, so I just want to give a big greetings to all of you. I see my wife there hiding. Hello, Barbara. So you can all say hi to Barbara in the chat box and make her feel uncomfortable. And so for all you dignitaries and VIPs and awesome people that I truly love and adore, hello to all of you. And you know who you are, but we're not going to do titles and introductions and all that good stuff here. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hit the record button and we will get started. All righty. And let me start the presentation up. All righty. Can you all see my presentation? Either give a thumbs up or yes, not. Okay, awesome.
Yes.
Awesome. And I'm going to keep admitting people.
Thumbs up.
Thank you, thank you. And sorry, I got to pause to admit people. Alrighty. Great. So for all you new folks, you missed my introduction, but you'll catch it on Facebook. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started on this presentation on the Quadrivium. If you don't know what that word means, you will learn by the end of this presentation. So this presentation is going to talk about understanding the language of the Creator. So for those that are Freemasons who do have a faith, for those that are just skulking about and want to learn more, most people that are Freemasons have a belief in a supreme being or a creator. And I think, at least in my studies and my readings, I found that the Quadrivium really speaks to understanding the language behind that creator, whether you call him God or Allah or Yahweh or what have you. So this presentation is going to talk about that. So with that, I will go ahead and get started. So no study of the Quadrivium, the purpose and the symbolism inherent to the system of the liberal arts, can begin without an overview of the entire liberal arts system of education as a whole, the history of it and its purpose throughout the rise, decline, and rebirth of Western civilization. The Quadrivium is the later or second part of the liberal arts education system that began in the time of Western antiquity. So we're talking about Greco-Roman times and before. But it wasn't named the Quadrivium until many centuries later. So for hundreds of years, it defined the middle part of the medieval education system. So now we're talking about the Middle Ages. A middle degree of sorts, and helped to formalize systems of learning all the way to the rise of the modern university system today. In this presentation, we're going to discuss what it means, where it came from, why did we need to learn it, why we stopped learning it, how it all fits together, and finally, what it teaches us, or at least me, about the creation and ultimately our creator. So what does it mean? The Latin word quadrivium literally translates to the four paths or the four roads, or the place where four roads meet, or quadra and via for those of you Latin scholars. What defines it are the four sciences that were taught as far back, formally, as far back as the Greco-Roman times to freeborn citizens as a type of higher learning system. It consists of the subjects of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. And I know Freemasons that are on here are freaking out because I said it out of order, but in the classical system of quadrivium study in Western antiquity, that's the order in which they were taught. It was arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and then music. So they were classically referenced in Plato's Republic and were the original formalized scientific arts. The term quadrivium did not exist until the 6th century CE, so many hundreds of years later. So prior to this, they existed in a similar form, but were separated from the three humanities that comprise the trivium. And we'll define that and talk about that, what that means for those who don't know. So it's notable that the terms trivium and quadrivium were coined many centuries later, once they were formalized into that system of liberal arts education for the medieval university system. So a combination of the trivium or trivium and quadrivium give us the 7 liberal arts of classical antiquity, which persisted or in many other ways were reborn through the medieval university system and to our modern times. And sorry, I keep stopping everybody, but I have to admit people. So like we said, quadrivium and trivium come from a later naming of the 7 liberal arts and sciences that were found in classical antiquity. One of the earliest written records of the subjects were found in the Quadrivium is found in Plato's Republic, specifically the 7th book of Plato's Republic, which was written about the 370s BCE, where he sets out his ideas for a proper education. For Plato, Plato espoused the belief that one must study the 5, not 4 mathematical disciplines. And so that's an original copy of Plato's Republic. That is Plato. So at the time, in Plato's time, there were 5, not 4 mathematical disciplines. They were arithmetic, geometry, solid geometry, astronomy, and harmonics or music. Later on, the disciplines of plane and solid geometry, which shaped much of the classical world in terms of science and architecture, were recombined into simply geometry. According to Plato, after mastering these mathematical disciplines after the trivium, one can then move on to the more complex disciplines of philosophy. So for a comprehensive and amazing breakdown on the trivium, I've already touched upon it. Please reach out to Brother Robert Marshall from Texas, who, like I said, most interesting and thought-provoking pieces on the trivium I have ever seen. But didn't get to see it or aren't going to get to see it. The trivium, in short, is the beginning of that path. the Quadrivium being the middle of that path. And can you all still hear me and see the screen? I got a little thing saying my connection was a little weird. Thanks. Okay. So the trivium is the big path, and it consists of logic and rhetoric. So in the study of grammar, we learn about language, how to construct and how to understand that language that we use. In logic, we study thought and analysis, how to take the tools of reading and writing to form coherent thoughts. Then rhetoric, we take the mastery of the language and thoughts and ideas and learn to or transmit those to another person as wisdom or gnosis. It's that knowledge, quote unquote grammar, now understood, logic, and being transmitted outwards as gnosis, which is rhetoric. So the trivium is basically how to learn. And sorry, I'm getting pop-ups here. Thank you. Appreciate it. So the trivium teaches us how to learn, how to read, how to write, how to form coherent thoughts, and then finally how to impart that onto others. So that's the purpose of the trivium, the how. The quadrivium is the what. What are you learning? So you're learning basically all the elements of the world around us and become that well-educated, freeborn human being, at least according to the ancient Greco-Romans. So after the trivium, we move on to the quadrivium, which prepared a smaller subset. So most everybody learned the trivium, and a lot of times you learned it, especially in Western antiquity, you learned it at home. Your father was the one that taught you grammar and logic, and then you would move on to rhetoric when you got a little bit older, and then you would learn the quadrivium. And all this stuff was learned in a linear progression. You did not learn the way we learn today, where you get English class and math class and science class and PE and, you know, a lunch break and a study hall. There was a very linear progression to the way people were taught in classical antiquity, and it was done for a reason. And we'll talk about what those differences are as well. So once we move on to the quadrivium, it prepares a smaller subset of the ancient and medieval students for future professional study in things like theology, philosophy, medicine, or law. And again, we're talking about classical antiquity, and we're also talking about medieval universities. So the rise of the modern university system. So after the basics of language and thought and transmission of language and thought are learned in the trivium, the student is then ready to learn the mechanics behind the order inherent to the universe. So one can now learn how the underlying mechanisms of number, geometry, and physics provide a language to us for the inner workings of the cosmos itself. Now, the universe doesn't require your comprehension in order for planets to revolve around stars. The creation doesn't care if you know that gravity bends both space and time to keep us the same distance from our mediocre yellow star that we call the sun. But in that understanding, we find and discover rhythms and the underpinnings of a design and an order to creation itself. So this order, built into the very fabric of creation, both in the macrocosm and the microcosms, bring us that much closer to understanding the creation itself. Not the purpose of it, but certainly our place in it. And the concepts of the quadrivium, as we said, build off one another in a very linear and logical progression. So the quadrivium defines the mechanics of the numbers used throughout the entirety of space-time. For those that are not science nerds like me, both space and time were created at the very beginning of the universe. The moment of creation was not an explosion of space. It was not an explosion in space. It was an explosion of space. And the clock of forward time started with the very birth of the universe itself. So since our search into this order began, we've defined that order as arithmetic, or number. Geometry was number in space. Harmonics, or music, was number in time. And astronomy was number in space and time. They can also be classified as the four elements of the quadrivium as follows. Arithmetic is pure. Geometry is stationary. Astronomy is moving. And music is applied. And we'll see the nuances of music in a little bit. So why did we stop learning it? Well, technically we never have. The manner in which the 7 liberal arts and sciences were taught has changed over time, from medieval times to the Renaissance to the Enlightenment to the modern education system that we have today with, you know, warts and all. But technically we never did stop learning the trivium and the quadrivium. but the bare bones concepts of the quadrivium and the trivium are somewhat inherent to the modern education system today. Elementary schools still teach the fundamentals of language and the fundamentals of arithmetic. Logic is hinted at in elementary mathematics, and rhetoric oftentimes relegated to an extracurricular activity such as debate club. Geometry is taught in its barest essence at the end of elementary school or at the beginning of middle and high school. Music and musical theory is oftentimes an elective nowadays, and is touched upon throughout elementary school systems. Those of you that were given a recorder in elementary school, I'm pretty sure everybody here saw one at one point. That was your introduction to musical theory, as bad as you were playing it. So, but again, most of your professional music education really is an elective nowadays, but it is briefly touched upon in elementary and middle school and gets formalized a bit more as you move on in education. So all of the pieces of the 7 liberal arts are present in the modern education system, but in a much more cursory or generic form. Only specializing in one of these subjects in high school or university settings presents students with that really in-depth knowledge that you need in those subjects. And in reality, the Western education system is far removed from the classical liberal arts system of the past, especially the medieval university system. What we have really is an oversaturation of generalized information that has now become the norm, as opposed to the very careful and linear progression inherent to the trivium and then the quadrivium. Oops. So arithmetic. So the first of the 4 scientific arts, arithmetic is one of the first things we learn as children, along with learning how to read and how to write. On a deeper level, it pertains to the study of numbers themselves and is the core basis for a whole range of other subjects that we delve into as we advance through life. Though it gets more complicated as we grow up, with decimal points, fractions, and more complex operations with more numbers being added at the end, the basics of arithmetic, however, really remain the same and don't change. The earliest written records of arithmetic being used date back to the Egyptians and the Babylonians around 2500 to 2000 BCE, but most likely began much earlier. It was around the 4th century BCE when the Greeks found a way to combine mathematics with their mystical and philosophical beliefs. The oldest and most elementary part of mathematics, arithmetic, studies the properties of operations between numbers, so addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Arithmetic is an essential subject to understand and is meant to prepare students for more specialized professions. Although nowadays we like to use computers or calculators to do these operations for us, understanding the basic principles of arithmetic and knowing how to compute for the answer manually really is essential to daily practical life. So speaking on the age of arithmetic, here we have the Ishango bone, and it was found in the Ishango region of what's present-day Congo, and has been dated to over 20,000 years old. Upon its first discovery, it was thought to portray a series of prime numbers. In the book, How Mathematics Happened the First 50,000 Years, great book if you're a math nerd, the author argues that the development of the concept of prime numbers could only have come about after the concept of division, which he dated to written records of about 10,000 BC. So these are probably not prime number marks, but the Ishango bone does at least display what appear to be tally marks. And everybody here knows what a tally mark is. So tally marks are a primitive form of unary counting system. And what that means is counting by ones. So it's not a base 10 counting system or a base 16, it's a base 1 counting system. Okay. So the next one, geometry, is an area within mathematics that focuses its studies on the shape, position, and size of figures in space. In geometry, there are certain aspects that need to be considered, such as dimension and symmetry of the figures in question. So its study in Greece can be traced back to at least the 6th century BCE, and a number of different ways to study it have been created and modified over the years. The exact early history of Greek geometry is kind of unclear because there's no original sources of information, and all of our knowledge is from secondary sources written many years after the early period. Plato would be considered a secondary source. However, we can still see a decent overview and also start to look at some of the great names of those Greek mathematicians who would shape the course of Greek geometry for centuries to come. The first and one of the greatest names, and some of you may not have heard of him, is Thales of Miletus, a mathematician living in the 6th century BCE. He's regarded as the father of geometry and began the process of using deduction from first principles. We'll talk about what that is in a second. It's believed that he traveled to Egypt and Babylon, picking up geometric techniques from these cultures and bringing them back to Greece. Thales strongly believed that reasoning trumped experimentation and simple intuition, and began to look for solid principles which he could build into theorems or proofs. So this introduced the idea of proofs into geometry, much to anybody who has a 9th or a 10th grader, much to their chagrin. So this is where proofs came from. But he did propose some axioms that he believed to be mathematical truths that would never change. Thales is credited with devising a method for finding the height of a ship at sea. And you can see an example there. A technique that he used to measure the height of a pyramid, not documented as a proof until that point in time, even though pyramids had existed long before that. For this, he had to understand proportion and possibly the rules governing similar triangles, which is one of the staples of geometry and later trigonometry. So probably the most famous name during the development of Greek geometry is Pythagoras, even if only for that famous law concerning right angle triangles. This mathematician lived in a secret society, which took on a semi-religious mission. From this, the Pythagoreans developed a number of ideas and began to develop early trigonometry. The Pythagoreans added a few new axioms to the trove of Greek geometric knowledge. These include the sum of internal angles of any triangle equaling 180 degrees, and the sum of all the external angles of a triangle equaling 360 degrees. We then move on to Euclid, whose creations talked about axioms, points, lines, and planes. He taught that the geometry of position is the study of the relative position of figures and their spatial relation, which led to a series of questions that helped improve knowledge on the subject of geometry in general. Although there wasn't very much new content attributed to Euclid, he was the first to show how these propositions could fit into a comprehensive, single logical system, which we now call geometry. The concepts written in his book, The Elements, were the basis for what we now call algebra and number theory. So tradition has it that this phrase, mireis aheimetrios isitos montin stegen, that's the Greek, meaning let no one ignorant of geometry enter, was engraved at the door of Plato's Academy, the school which he founded in Athens in the 4th century BCE. In a more modern application, recent study shows that physicists are connecting geometry as a vital aspect to string theory. So this attempt on unifying the four universal forces of the cosmos, which are, should have a slide for that, gravity, the weak nuclear force, the strong nuclear force, and the electromagnetic force, into one single theory, holds geometry as its underlying connecting factor. So some scientists strongly believe that there is a possibility of making predictions about the physical world through this string theory, of which geometry is a very vital part. Music, or harmonics. So as a form of art, music has played a significant role in civilizations and cultures around the globe. There's a lot of cultural references to music. It's been used and continues to be used as a way to unite people in social gatherings, whether the purpose is to give thanks and celebrate or even to mourn. Just like any other form of art, music evokes feelings. Still, it remains more accessible than most other types of art. Not everyone can sculpt or paint or appreciate art on a canvas. And although not everyone can play a musical instrument, except for you recorder savants, almost everyone enjoys and appreciates one type of music over another. So long ago, there lived a people who believed the world was made of music. Above them, the skies sang, and within them, melody knit the universe together. So hearing harmony in both the world without and the world within, those hermetic concepts again, they created their own music to echo it. Through the art of composition, they transposed the intangible universal laws into realities that could be grasped by the human senses, most notably our ears. These people were the ancients in Greco-Roman times and even the medievals. And they believed in the harmony of the spheres, which you can see on the right. As cosmology, which is no longer accepted, obviously, but it did have that same power of explanation of the universe that modern cosmology has for us today. So documented by Boethius in around the year 500, this cosmology defined music into three different kinds. Musica mundana, the music made by the rotations of the heavenly bodies and their concentric spheres, because that's what they believed cosmology was back then. Then you have musica humana, the harmonies holding together man's body and spirit into one form. And finally, musica instrumenta, the music made by man in imitation of the previous two. Boethius espoused that the first two kinds of music, although they were real, were inaudible to human beings. But the laws of proportion and harmony could be deduced through a careful study of music theory and ultimately creation. And these laws then formed the basis of the original music theory that was taught in medieval times, allowing that heavenly music to be translated for our mundane human ears. So as part of their well-rounded education, students in the medieval university would study music and learn to interpret and detect the spaces between notes in their relation with other notes. This helps students tap into their creative side and not just rely on intellect alone. They learn how to open up and balance their intellect with their feelings, honing them into equally intelligent and sensitive individuals, something you don't see too much nowadays. This early idea remains to this day and is taught in some of the most prestigious music universities around the world. So astronomy, this little shout out goes to my daughter, Maribel, who's probably watching. Her and I love that flat earth documentary on Netflix, Behind the Curve. So if you haven't seen it, it is 2 hours. You will absolutely enjoy it. It is fantastic and hysterical. So that was, I put in there for her. But so astronomy helps any person put things into perspective. It's very easy to get lost in your small little world comprised of a city or a couple of cities, or if you're lucky enough, a few cities or towns in between your travels from work to home and lodge and back and forth. You probably stay in touch with a small group of people or interact on a daily basis with even fewer. However, if you take the time to observe what is happening in outer space and not just in your own little inner space, things sometimes fall into a better sense of perspective. Again, we refer to the macro and the microcosms. So through astronomy, we're reminded that we are but a tiny speck in a vast universe that exists all around us. Astronomy is one of the oldest sciences known to man, dating to the first observations made by the earliest civilizations. Astronomy was a way of understanding the world around them, a way to learn how and when to plant crops, when to sow, and when to get protection against cold and inclement weather. In many older textbooks, the ancient Greeks are often referred to as the fathers of ancient astronomy, developing elegant theories and mathematical formula to describe the wonders of the cosmos, a word that, like many others in our language, came to us from the Greeks. In fact, this assumption, unfortunately, is very incorrect. While the ancient Greek astronomers made huge contributions to astronomy, that knowledge was built upon the solid foundations laid by cultures that came many centuries before. So we have the Mesopotamians and the Zoroastrian astronomers and astrologers in the Fertile Crescent and the deserts of Persia that made sophisticated observations and devised complex theories to describe these cosmological phenomena. I talk about astronomers and astrologers because they were both important to the study of astronomy. This ancient wisdom passed into the hands eventually of the Greek philosophers that were thirsty and greedy for knowledge when Alexander the Great conquered the entirety of that region in the 330s BCE. Greece also lay at the crossroads of many trade routes, so ancient knowledge from things like the Indian Vedas and Chinese astronomers added to that store of knowledge that was accumulated by the Greeks. The ancient Greek philosophers refined astronomy, taking it from being just an observational science with an element of prediction into a full-blown theoretical science. The ancient astronomers used the science of the stars to track time and cycles for agricultural purposes, as well as adding astrology to their sophisticated observations. They didn't really generate any new theories concerning astronomy and were more concerned with what was happening and when it would happen, not addressing the why. And they oftentimes relegated that to vague references to their pantheons of gods in their astrology. So it wasn't until the late 19th or 20th centuries when people began to do what was actually called theoretical astronomy, an attempt to find out more than they could actually see. That's why it's theoretical. Since then, people have studied everything that they could think of about the universe, from the early observable moments of the young hot universe seen here, to the geometry and physics found in the singularity of a black hole. Today, astronomy is often called astrophysics. By definition, it's a natural science that focuses on the study of celestial bodies, including but not limited to planets, asteroids, nebula, moons, galaxies, comets, and black holes. It also studies their chemical, physical, and evolutionary processes and how they interact with one another using those fundamental forces of nature, which we now learned are most likely connected by geometry. So today, we've mastered the orbits of our planets and the moons in our solar system, and we find new discoveries such as black holes and dark matter that have led to a new series of investigations led by some of the brightest minds in the world in an attempt to better understand what is happening to us and around us. Students who studied astronomy as part of the Quadrivium learned how to measure the movement of these celestial objects. Being given the chance to understand things from a more macro point of view, they would end their training precisely with this subject in order to move on to greater and more specialized concepts and ideas. So astronomy is the fourth and last subject of study in the Quadrivium, the higher division of these liberal arts. Along with arithmetic, music, and geometry, it gave students back then an opportunity to gain a better grasp of the world on a very graduating scale, from the very simple and small to the very large and complex. So through rudimentary knowledge and understanding of space and movement, followed by a practical application of this knowledge, the bigger picture was therefore becoming more and more refined and more appreciated and ultimately more understood. So even the amateur study of celestial bodies can change a person's outlook on life. You don't need to be a professional astrophysicist to understand certain things. If you take the time off your smartphones or computers to see the rings of Saturn through a backyard telescope, or go stargazing for constellations one night with your kids, it might expand your confined perspective in ways that are beyond limit expectations and even imagination. So what can this teach us, especially about the creation? So going back to Freemasonry a little bit, the degrees of Freemasonry are that path to enlightenment, a path traveled by an individual through initiation, through passing through veils, and then a ceremony of rebirth, or oftentimes known as raising, that's inherent to all formal initiation or transformational systems. We as Freemasons choose to utilize a legend of birth, death, and rebirth as this process to learn about our individual connection to the Creator. So how do we do that? For some, pure faith suffices to achieve that connection to divinity. For others, they're able to use reason and reason alone to discern the truths of the universe for themselves. For a smaller group still, and probably lots of people on this call I would include in that group, so for those fewer of us, it's a combination of faith in that guiding hand to creation, as well as the knowledge behind understanding the concepts in the macro and the microcosms that truly bring us closer to understanding the language of that creation moment. So through arithmetic and geometry, we learn that numbers are the underlying language of everything around us. Very observable numbers or observable patterns exist in all of creation, from the very microscopic to the galactic in size. Pi, which is rounded to 3.14, is a constant number that deals with circles. So every time there's a circle, there will always be pi. But there's another constant number, phi or phi, which also appears everywhere in nature. The number is 1.618 ... The number is based on the Fibonacci sequence, which you see below. So 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, and so on, where each number is the sum of the two numbers before it. So it's this phi or phi, this divine proportion, this golden ratio that appears everywhere in nature through spirals, pentagrams, and the arrangement of leaves around a stem. Just as an example, the length of the human forearm is 1.618, or phi, times the length of the hand. In the hand, there's 3 bones in each finger. It's the golden ratio or divine proportion. We have 8 fingers total, 5 digits per hand, 3 bones in each finger, 2 bones in one thumb, and 1 thumb on each hand, all numbers in the Fibonacci sequence. The inner ear is a perfect Fibonacci spiral. The features of the human face that you see are all in golden proportion. The side of a nautilus and many other animals found in nature form a perfect golden spiral. So to achieve that, if you place a 1-inch square next to another, next to a 2-inch square, next to a 3-inch square, next to a 5, next to an 8, and arrange them in a circle, you'll get this perfect golden spiral. By the way, this is the arrangement of the interior rooms and the exterior facing of the Parthenon. Look at the arrangement of seeds on a pine cone or squares on a pineapple. They're all arranged in a spiral form. The seeds on a sunflower are in a spiral, counter-spiral arrangement that matches that golden ratio. What about the petals on flowers? The number of petals in a flower consistently follows the Fibonacci sequence, naturally occurring in nature. Examples include the lily, which has 3 petals, buttercups, which have 5, the sunflower 21, the daisy 34, and the list goes on and on. Is this evidence of a divine portion or an order to numbers? Is it evidence of an orderly universe set in motion by a supreme being? Even in the very large, we see evidence of this order. Spiral galaxies also follow the familiar Fibonacci pattern. The Milky Way has several spiral arms, each of them a spiral in a Fibonacci pattern. So as a testament to that order and beauty in the cosmos, spiral galaxies appear to defy traditional Newtonian physics. So in the early 1900s, astronomers realized that if spiral galaxies followed regular Newtonian physics, you know, galaxies that they spin around, and if they all spin around at the same, according to the spiral in which they're built, the speed of the outside and the speed of the inside of a spiral galaxy will not be the same speed. So eventually the outer arms of a spiral galaxy will start to peter off and just go away, but they don't. The arms that should be stretched out and eventually leave the galaxy itself, they don't. They stay in that consistent, beautiful spiral shape. So the stars on the outside move at a speed that is much higher than expected, which keeps that galaxy in its shape. So there's a very orderly and beautiful adaptation that we see in that macrocosm, talking on a galactic scale, that occurs that preserves the order and beauty of the cosmos and gives it that, that definition and that order. So even in the microscopic realm, it's not immune to Fibonacci or that golden ratio. The DNA molecule measures 34 angstroms. Let me see what my mouse is. 34 angstroms by 21 angstroms. And the golden ratio of 1.618 exists between each major and minor cusp of a strand of DNA. So these numbers, 34 and 21, are numbers in that Fibonacci series, and their ratio, I'm sorry, I was wrong. It's 1.619, but it's very close to 5. So the Quadrivium teaches us that there really is an order to everything around us that occurs naturally in the world and the universe around us. Random chance doesn't add perfection and symmetry to the smallest and largest things that we find in the universe. A guiding hand, whatever you wish to call it, created a universe that really was perfectly balanced with just the right amount of matter and antimatter to form the observable universe. So again, for those that aren't science nerds like me, for every billion particles of antimatter that were created in the Big Bang, there was 1,000,000,001 particles of matter. And the leftovers of this cosmic annihilation created everything that you see here today. This guiding hand created a universe with the exact amount of gravity that was needed to coalesce hot gas into matter, nebula, stars, and eventually planets like the one that we live on. This guiding hand created a planet that was the exact distance away from the sun to sustain not only liquid water, but an atmosphere that we could breathe, and eventually the seeds of life. This guiding hand created the building blocks of life in DNA with a precise order and harmony that we've only begun to unlock in the last 50 years. So why is the Quadrivium as well as the Trivium taught to us, especially as Freemasons? Because it is an organized way of learning how to interpret language, then ideas, then impart those ideas as wisdom, how to understand the numbers found in everything, the geometric patterns of life and space, as well as the orbits of our planets, the underlying music of the stars and the black holes in the sky, as well as the whale song in our deepest oceans. They teach us, or at least were meant to teach us, how to understand the language of creation. And in learning how our Creator speaks through us through his creation, we get a better understanding of our place in the universe, our own special, tiny, unique place in this 93 billion light year across cosmos. It's through the 7 liberal arts where we ultimately learn that we're unique, that we're special, and that we're created for a purpose. Even the word universe implies an order, where uni means one, and verse means a single line or verse of song or poetry. There has ever been, and there will only be, one Joe, one Barbara, one Jeremy, one Don, one Tim. That uniqueness amidst the infinity of stars is what gives our life meaning. So through these arts and sciences, learning them in a very linear progression, are we able to bring ourselves that much closer to communion with the creation and ultimately our Creator. And I put this picture back up just to show you, even though we are that vast, tiny speck in the universe, there's only one of you. There's only ever was one of you, and there will only ever be one of you. So that uniqueness alone, gives me purpose, at least. And with that actually concludes my presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to, if you have a question or a comment, or if you want to complain or moan, just take your lines off of mute and fire away.
I have a question.
Please.
First of all, thank you. That was awesome. I loved all the images, and especially how you said that we don't have to be getting a degree on everything. We can explore these big subjects on our own and grow inward and outward that way, expand our mind and learning. So my question is about Pythagoras. You mentioned his secret society, or you mentioned it as a secret society, his school. Can you say something about it further?
Well, for those who don't know me, I'm definitely a mystery school fan. I definitely have read a lot and looked into, the school of the Pythagoreans, the Eleusinians. It starts to get a little sideways when you get to Roman times with Mithraic cults and stuff like that. They start to kind of lose their meaning a little bit in terms of what their purpose was. And that's where a lot of the weird, well, my daughter's on here, so I can't say it. So, a lot of the weird extra stuff happens. But in terms of the Pythagoreans, I mean, again, at least for me, and if someone knows better, please chime in. There was really not a big line of separation between science and faith. There was a lot of harmony there between, learning geometry or earth measurement and, what the gods were telling us. Astrology today, we treat as a funny word, right? People make fun of using the word astrology, but back then, astronomers and astrologers had two very unique and important jobs. Astronomers made observations, and astrologers found meaning behind them and, found practical applications to them. Nowadays, most people don't treat astrology in that way, but there really were two divergent paths that answered the same question. This is what was happening and this is why it was happening. And they really were very important skill sets. So in terms of the Pythagoreans, at least from my reading, which is probably limited compared to some of the people I see on this call, there really was that union between, science and the mysteries, and they were hand in hand. And that's why they were taught, especially in, the way Pythagoreans taught. There was a lot of extra stuff going on there where, you would learn from behind a veil and things like that. And, I won't get into too many details, but at least for me, science and religion, at least in my worldview, they complement each other, right? You have the how and you have the why, and they don't have to be exclusive. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I hope it did.
Yes, thank you.
Anybody else?
Hey, Joe.
Sir.
I captured just a few comments and questions that some folks had.
Oh, please, thank you.
But I'm gonna be selfish and ask my question first.
Go.
So when we're looking at the transformation from kind of a liberal arts system, as we moved through history into a modern system of education that Horace Mann largely brought over here, do you find just, and it's okay to say you don't know, you haven't looked there, right? Because it's often left field. But have you looked at anything that showed, like, did Horace Mann value anything in these types of liberal systems and try to implement them in his plan when we brought kind of like this system of education that we use now?
Well, I mean, for any educators in the room, I'm going to apologize in advance for my commentary because I have, and my wife's on this call, so she'll agree with me. We have a very unique outlook on the modern education system, in that it really is, and I think I mentioned this earlier, it's basically a Wikipedia version compared to the linear progression that you found in classical antiquity, right? You learn grammar first. You learn reading and writing first. You didn't learn anything else. And then once you mastered reading and writing, then you moved on to logic, and you learned about logical operations, and you learned nothing else. And by the time you got to rhetoric is when you started learning arithmetic. So you learn these things in a very linear fashion. Our kids' school days are not like that, right? Like my daughter, who's probably on this call, she gets biology first period, then she gets world history second period, then she gets language arts or whatever the hell they call it. Then she gets math. And the way our kids have been taught, at least from very early age, and I have kids in elementary school and high school and everything in between, you just get a little taste of everything and then you move on to the next thing. So it really is, that Wikipedia analogy, unfortunately, really fits. It's, you get that 30,000 foot view of something and then you move on to something. So it really espouses that jack of all trades, master of none education model. So is that the wrong way? I mean, we've been doing it for over a century. All of us learned by that model as well.
I mean, 200 years versus, I mean, what's the oldest now? We got 65,000-year-old human teeth. But so Scott Sherman wanted to commend you for using proper dating structures, CE, BCE.
You're welcome, Scott.
Somebody asked a question, and I didn't capture the name, but he said, did Joe say anything about the Quadrivium being 4 ways to know God through the mental emanation of numbers?
I definitely would not have said no God, because I definitely find that quote unquote guiding hand of the divine in science, especially through the Quadrivium. You can't tell me otherwise. And again, that's my personal belief structure, right? But I've always...
So, correction, to know as in...
Oh, shit, you scared me. Okay. So yeah, I mean, I think it does for me. Because again, the more you know about the how, I think it's easier to grasp the why. And again, this is my personal opinion. I'm not putting my beliefs on all of you. I appreciate that you took the time to listen to me blabber for 45 minutes, but I find an appreciation for the creator in understanding how his creation works, if that makes sense. So the more I know that and the more I understand that, the deeper sense of appreciation I find for just how perfect it all is. You know what I mean? And I touched on it in my presentation, but the kinds of things that I think about are, if gravity was just a tiny bit higher or a tiny bit lower at the moment of creation, none of us would exist here. Atoms would not have come together. Planets would not have formed. Stars would not have coalesced and started fusion. None of us would be here. That picture of the Goldilocks zone, if we were a tiny bit closer or a tiny bit further away from the sun, none of us would be here right now. It's really hard for me to, as an intelligent, thinking human being, to chalk that all up to random chance. I just find it hard. For those of you that do, God bless you. But I just can't. There's just way too many random things that had to happen in 4 billion years for us to show up and use Zoom and, be able to debate this stuff. Any other commentary?
Yeah, thank you very much, brother. You are giving us a lot of knowledge that was missing somehow out of our minds. Quick question. Um, how about the same kind of intelligence or alike through another galaxy? And you know what I'm talking about is another form of life out there. Do you still believe in that? Do you believe in that? Not still, but do you believe in that? And is it possible that we somehow might get in contact, or we're just so small still in our intelligence and development as human intelligence that we are just nothing for them to be taken care about? Or what is your thoughts about it, please?
Sure. Well, all kidding aside, even though most of you people know I'm a big Ancient Aliens fan, I will veg out on that show 24 hours a day, as much as my wife hates it. But all kidding aside, you know, and I quote this to my daughter, brings this up all the time. You know, she asks if I think we're alone in the universe and things like that. And every time she does, I think of, have you all seen that movie Contact with Jodie Foster? And it's that part where she's talking to her dad, and you know, she asked that question, and I always think of this as the answer of, you know, if we're alone in the universe, and her dad says, well, if we are, you know, it'd be a really awful waste of space. And I think about that a lot. I mean, the universe really is so much bigger than our minds can comprehend, and it's been around far longer than we're going to be. So do I think we're the only ones? I'd like to think not. It really would be an awful waste of space. But again, a lot of things need to happen for a planet to be in the right place and for an atmosphere to coalesce. And I mean, look how hard it is for us to find planets that look like ours. You know, exoplanet science has only been around, you know, really for around 30, 40 years. And they still haven't found very many planets that, you know, quote unquote, look Earth-like. You know, so once we stop messing up this world, I don't know where we're going to move to next, but to answer your question, do I think we're alone? So conspiracy theories aside, I'd like to think not. But it's a really big universe. If we're only talking about our universe, and not things like a multiverse, where I'm sure that I'm trying to answer this and not sound super crazy. If we are alone, it'd be a really big waste of space, and I will leave it at that.
Joe, that was a fantastic presentation. I want to say this. It's not really a question, but you just said something that made me think about it. Dr. Francis Crick, who was one of the co-discoverers of the DNA molecule, he was a devout atheist, but he was also a brilliant mathematician. And he ran the numbers of what the likelihood would be of life forming, even just as so much as amino acids coming together and forming one cell. What's the likelihood of that happening? And he came to the conclusion that mathematically life should not exist in the universe. And he stopped short of admitting that there was a supreme being, only because he had, been a devout atheist, and he didn't want to, do an about face. But he said that there was evidence that there had to be some kind of intelligence behind the design of the universe. There's no other way life could exist.
Well, to your point, look at everybody loves to throw Stephen Hawking, bring up his atheism. He really wasn't technically an atheist. He was more of a scientist and an agnostic, but he's been quoted using that guided hand metaphor a couple of times in his books, one which I have on my shelf. He was a brilliant dude, and I think that, it's a big stretch to move from, no belief to some belief, and I'm not here to convert people. That's not my job, and I'm not here to, proselytize. But like I said, I find it very hard to believe that, exactly to your point, that all these things could have randomly happened, random, for you to be sitting there, looking as pretty as you are in a kilt and smoking a cigar and, you know, enjoying
Thank you, honey.
Yes, enjoying a lovely evening of fellowship. That's exactly to your point. It's statistically impossible for that to happen. And somebody excellent point, Todd C. Atheism does require faith. That's a great line. But yeah, exactly to your point.
I got a question for you.
Yes, sir.
Coming from a science background and having taken a nightmare class called inorganic chemistry, are you aware of the similarities in and complexities in silicon chemistry and crystalline structures?
Somewhat. I'm so glad you said that. I hate it because we were just talking about this with my daughter. I loved organic chem. I despised inorganic chem. So for all you chemists here, I'm sorry. Yeah, I mean, look at the structure, look at the similarities between silica compounds and carbon compounds. There's a lot of similarities in those chains that form the building blocks of you and I. Maybe not RJ, but you and I. And you know, but
Sorry, go ahead.
but there is a lot of similarities in how those things form. So, you know, you see on TV or you watch the Science Channel, you'll see, you know, maybe there is other life out there that isn't carbon based, and that's totally fine. And I'm okay with that. You know, it doesn't, you know, there's all shapes and all sizes out there. So.
Yeah, you got a comment on there. Don't pick on RJ.
That's my wife. That's okay. I'm gonna.
Hey, thanks. I won't get crazy deep into that, but when I was taking inorganic chemistry, that just kept coming back over and over and over. The complexities of the bonding is a little different. Would make it a little bit more difficult to substitute out carbon for silicon, but for those of you that haven't, I don't have a good book that I could recommend. No good books on inorganic chemistry, really. But the concept and the available bonding pairs is pretty close. So thanks for that, Joe.
No, thank you.
Hey, Joe.
Just going through the chat. Yes, please.
Hey, this is Tim. For his great presentation, I really appreciated it. Got a lot out of it.
Thanks, man.
My question had to do with the ritual and how this is taught within Freemasonry. I realize this is not tiled, so I won't go into too much. But prior to the Preston or Webb lectures, you know, we know there wasn't a real standardization of how or what was taught within Masonic lodges or emphasized. And now we're in the era of the, you know, Preston and Webb ritual. What are your ideas on ways that we could do this better and teach these concepts better? And I'll take my answer off there.
No, that's fine. I mean, my on-air answer would be, realistically, we don't teach it, right? You hear it once and you hear it in a lecture, and that's really the only time you hear it. You know, that doesn't break any rules. And Don, if you're chomping at the bit to chime in, please feel free. But we don't teach it. It's not taught. It's mentioned and it's referenced once. And for me, the quote unquote mystery school guy, that drives me batshit, for lack of a better term, right? Because all we do is gloss over a concept, and it's not just the quadrivium, it's the trivium as well, right? Because the majority of people out there don't know how to form coherent thoughts, and they don't know how to think, and they don't know how to argue well. All these things that were taught to people centuries ago as a process to become a grown-up, and we don't teach that. We mention it and we move on, and that's really it. And I mean, most of you know the deal. You're left to fend for yourself and find that knowledge elsewhere. But so I would say my on-air answer would be, I don't know, maybe let's teach it, or let's teach people how to learn it. I mean, I can think of many people, both Masons and non-Masons, that would benefit from learning how to argue, learning what rhetoric actually is, learning how to form a logical thought. But in this soundbite reality,
chicos, ya hay que dormir.
okay, whatever you just said. And, you know, in this soundbite culture that we live in, I don't know if people have the patience for it anymore. But to answer your question, we don't teach it at all. Maybe we should, and maybe we should do it in the correct order. And I think it's never too early to start.
What we do teach is to seek. So all of this is fair game to seek.
What Don said. Listen to Don. Don't listen to me. I'm just going through the chats here. So Dave Felty, how are you, sir? Brought up an interesting question. We're talking about he's mentioning Carl Sagan, who I love Carl Sagan. And they're actually redoing Cosmos, if you guys have cable, with Neil deGrasse Tyson. Awesome show. So he says that Sagan was wrong. We are in a very, very special place. I would never contend that Carl Sagan thought that we were, you know, I know you're referring to, you know, the
insignificant galaxy, insignificant star, insignificant planet, on and on and on. He had this, I want to be really, really small complex.
He did. Well, and I think to your point, I was actually reading Neil deGrasse Tyson's book where he references it. It's a great book, especially if you're not a science nerd. It's, I believe it's Astrophysics for People in a Hurry. It's like a 45-minute read. And it's basically, you know, astrophysics in a nutshell. But I grew up in New York, so this story has relevance for me. But if you've ever been to New York City and you've ever gone to the Hayden Planetarium, I think some of you had to have. I grew up in New York, so I would spend summers there, especially because it was air conditioned all the time. So you go to the Hayden Planetarium, and they had if you've ever been to a planetarium, they had a space show, right? And you said you look up at the hemisphere and you watch this show. And Neil deGrasse Tyson said that in his book, the first time they had done it, a psychologist wanted to give people a survey after they left. It was about, you know, the universe, and it was you started with the planet Earth, and you zoomed out all the way to the end of the universe, and then you zoomed back. And I forget the name of the actual show, but the psychologist reached out to the museum and said they wanted to give people a survey and gauge their responses to the show, and they did. And what Neil deGrasse Tyson said in his book was that an overwhelming amount of people, after they watched that planetarium show about how small and how tiny, and, you know, we live on a tiny little speck of dust on a pale blue dot in a, you know, place where a mundane star is, they felt genuinely depressed about their existence after watching that. And, you know, for me, going back to the how informs the why for me, you know, I watch Carl Sagan and I completely don't get that. Or I listen to Neil deGrasse Tyson. I don't get that sense that size equates to insignificance, right? I think we are unique. I mean, Dave, there's only ever going to be one of you ever, you know, in the past, in the present, in the future. There's only going to be one of me ever. You know, I'm sure some of you are thankful for that, but you are you, and there's never going to be another you ever, you know, in the future, the past. So just that uniqueness alone, I think, speaks volumes to how important we are as people, as a civilization, as people who are custodians of this planet and this universe and this galaxy. And I'm going to get off my soapbox now, but great point.
You know, I would add that maybe Sagan was trying to get people to have a sense of reverence and awe, you know, for the enormity. Is that a word? Enormity? Yeah, I think so.
I like it. If it's
Anybody
not.
else say that? No. So enormity of everything in the universe. And maybe at that time people were too myopic and closed and didn't realize how vast the universe was and complicated things were. I doubt his intention was to sort of demean that we are special. Like I think you're saying, right, Joe? Is that it's not demeaning that we're special in some way.
Well, I mean, Dave made that point, but yeah,
it does lead to humility. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I disagree. I think that I don't think that their views were because Sagan would always talk about the complexity of us as creatures, you know what I mean? And the randomness for things to occur that would need to have us show up is just amazing and wonderful. And, you know, all of them said that. Hawking said that, Sagan said that, Tyson says that. So I don't think they think we're any less important because we really are on a tiny, small speck in comparison to the scope of things. I think that just gives us a better place to refine our focus on, wow, there's only one of me on this planet. There's only one Jeremy. And I think that in and of itself is important enough to give your life purpose or meaning. And for some, it's not. And that's a call to action, right? So if that is not enough for you, go give your life meaning. But here's how that life happened and how it came about and why you're here and why you're going to be the only one that's ever going to be here. So go do something with your life.
I'd like to point out an interesting concept developed by a biogeneticist named Robert Lanza. Lanza noticed in his work that DNA seemed to know how to mutate in the right direction. So he was curious as to whether intelligence was guiding DNA or if there was something about DNA that was intelligent. So he figured for DNA to have, all life begins with DNA, for DNA to have begun and to have existed for 200 plus million years, what forces and what components were necessary for that to happen, in which quantities. And he calculated the probability of all of this happening purely by chance and came out with more than 200 variables and said the more easier way to explain it would be that you would have a better chance of locating one atom in the universe than for life to happen by chance. So his conclusion, which is called biocentrism, is that consciousness, the mind, creates the physical universe so that we have a platform to have this experience we call life. Life is not an accident in the universe. Life is the purpose for the universe. So you want to look up biocentrism.
Well, thanks for sharing. That was wonderful.
Joe, I would say is a few people mentioned the word probability. So in an infrastructure like, we'll say, our universe, seemingly limitless, probably 93 billion light years. If anything is limitless, a construct such as a probability is also limitless. So to say if something is 5 out of 10 in a contained unit, in a limitless unit, it disappears. So life probability, all these things, blow up in probability. So just, I would say, keep that in mind.
No, indeed. And exactly to your point, well, you're talking about, and I mean, these are the kinds of things that I talk about with my uber nerd daughter. I am a big believer in the multiverse theory. Universes upon universes upon universes and multiple realities. I think, exactly to your point, one universe, 93 billion light years across, there's way more to existence than just that, right?
I think you should invite Maribel to speak the next time you come on with a program.
I'm sure she would not mind that at all. Yeah, in fact, the last time she
would blow her mind.
I think there's a couple of people on here that she was with me the last time I spoke, and she got up and corrected me a couple of times
there you go.
in the middle of my presentation. So yeah, but yeah, yeah, she would take over and speak. That's right. Any other questions?
What is the meaning of life?
I'm not touching that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Who created God?
Everybody who said 42, I will send you a care package. Good job, everybody.
That's strange.
42. Let's go make sure. I'll hit the Facebook comments later. I don't want to keep you all on, but thank you so much for coming. This was actually really fun. I've been working on this one for quite a while. And obviously I love this stuff and I'm a big Uber nerd. So when lodges are back in session, if you'd like me to come do this talk for your lodge, give me a shout. I'm on the interwebs. And again, thank you to everyone who came. I know your time is precious, and I know everybody is enjoying spending time with their families during this time, but I really appreciate you taking the time to sit with me and talk about life for 45 minutes. So thank you so much. And if you want to, I'm going to turn off the recording and the Facebook live stream. If you want to stay and shoot the breeze, please feel free.
You did a hell of a job, Joe. Thank you very much for that. That was
Thank
awesome.
you. Thank you so much.